Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and this episode is Q&A number 45. First, I want to remind you, as I did last week, that I got this suggestion from a listener to crowdsource tips and advice from people in the audience that have successfully managed to get the balance between family, job, and triathlon right. So the thinking that I had was to put together a series of short-form interviews in one single episode, probably. It could be something like rapid-fire questions about different things regarding time management and tips and tricks to get the training in even when things are busy. So it might be an interview, it might be just the listeners that are interested voicemailing me some answers to some predefined questions that I would send you so that we don't even have to schedule an interview and make time for that. So the format is a bit open still, but what I'm doing right now is to just collecting names of people that think that they would fit the bill. And if you are, please put your name in the hat, so to say, because you are doing all other listeners a massive favor by doing so, by helping out in just giving your tips and advice for how you have managed to find this sort of balance and what it is that allows you to handle everything and juggle everything. So to wrap this up, send an email to Michael at scientifictriathlon.com, and that's Michael with a K, if you are interested in helping out by sharing your advice. All right. And thank you to our sponsors as usual. First, we have Precision Hydration that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Take their free online sweat test that will give you an individual hydration strategy for your next race. And use the promo code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps, to get your first box for free. If you have already used that until the end of August, remember that we have a special promo that is limited time only. This promo code is ThatTriathlonShow20. So ThatTriathlonShow, all caps, and then a 20. And that will give you 20% off any order. So you can actually make a bigger order and stock up on electrolytes that will take you through a lot of training sessions and races. Hopefully. So again, go to precisionhydration.com and check them out. Next, we have Roka. Roka is the brand that redefines the standard in wetsuits, tri-suits, eyewear, and several other triathlon and endurance sports categories. They are used by some of the best athletes in the world, like that I've name dropped many, many times already, but also when you look at quantifying things, one great example showing how Roka is really, really valued among the best of the best is that in Kona, the Ironman World Championships, the swim skin count, which brand has the most swim skins present among the professional athletes, Roka has been winning for several consecutive years. So that goes to show that Roka swim skins are evidently the swim skins that are the most trusted. I don't know that there are any wetsuit counts in or tri-suit counts in other races. The Hawaii is the big dance, so it's obvious that that's where you would do those sorts of things. You also tend to see bike counts and power meter counts I've seen. Either way, Roka puts a lot of time, effort, and money into their R&D to make sure that their stuff is as fast as it can possibly be, and the pro athletes are picking up on it, and I think us age groupers should too. So check them out on roka.com and use the promo code TTS to get 20% off your entire order. So the first question that we have for today is a correction actually from last week. That was the question from Itai in Israel. He asked about the body using more carbs as the intensity rises, but the question was, what should you base that on, heart rate or pace when running? And similarly, should you base it on power or heart rate when cycling? And his example was that he had gone for a steady zone 2 pace run for an hour 45 minutes. But and the heart rate started out in zone 2, but climbed all the way to zone 4 because it got really hot and humid. And the question there was that did his body use more carbohydrate or more fat as fuel for that run? Because pace-wise, it would have been fat because it was a zone 2 run, but heart rate-wise, it rose to zone 4, so it was much more intense than that and would have been carbohydrate-based. So what I answered there was that that heart rate isn't necessarily a direct proxy for energy production in the cells, and heart rate can increase and decrease for other factors as well, among them heat, which is correct. But actually, Laki, who you heard on Monday's interview, my fellow coach here at Scientific Triathlon, he pointed out that heat can in fact change the fat and carbohydrate utilization, so that in hotter weathers you do use more carbohydrate. And there is a paper that I'll link to in the episode description called Modulation of Carbohydrate and Fat Utilization by Diet, Exercise and Environment. It's by Asker Jokendrup, so one of the most well-respected endurance sports nutrition researchers in the world. And he goes into basically some theories of why this is, why carbohydrate consumption or utilization increases as the weather gets hotter. So to answer your question there, Itai, in that case, when heart rate might have been rising due to the heat, that heat could also cause your carbohydrate utilization to increase. So I wanted to correct that because my answer wasn't entirely correct in last week's episode. And thank you to Lucky for pointing me to that resource and having this information in the first place. So by the way, one more thing I noticed when I reading this paper by Asker Jokendrup, the same is actually also true for unusually cold conditions, that your carb to fat utilization can increase in or sway in favor of carbohydrate when you're training in unusually cold conditions. So that's quite interesting. All right, so that was last week's question and the correction to that. The first real question for today is from Oscar in Venezuela, who writes, I'm used to train quite intensively for 7.3s in order to compete in my age group. Recently, I started training for an Ironman, and I have been focusing a lot on building base miles both on the bike and the run. I recently tested my FTP on the bike with the 2 times 8 minutes test, and surprisingly, it matched my all-time best FTP from when I was training hard for 7.3. At this point, it feels like this long, slow distance training is really improving how I feel during long workouts. But I really don't understand how I managed to maintain my best bike numbers without doing any intense training. This makes me wonder if there is actually a need to train for Ironman, if there is actually a need to train hard for the Ironman distance, or if I could just keep doing base miles and improving my aerobic base. Okay, thank you, Oscar, for your question. So let's get into this a little bit. It's a very interesting question. So you did your FTP test as 2 times 8 minutes. And the interesting thing here is that the first and the second one will have slightly different energy requirements. But if you just consider the first one, which is way easier, then an 8-minute effort on the bike would be powered by somewhere in the region of 88 to 95% aerobic energy. And only 5 to 12% of the energy would come from anaerobic energy production in endurance-trained athletes. So this is, I've sampled my athletes and athletes that I worked with in different capacities, whether it's consultations or things like that. Basically, any athletes that I have good, reliable data from. And they all fall in this range of 88 to 95% of aerobic metabolism for an 8-minute effort. So it's pretty evident, and it's such an aerobically dominated effort, that if you improve your aerobic base, you're absolutely going to see that impact big time in an 8-minute test. And it doesn't matter how you improve that aerobic base, whether it's long, slow distance or whether it's more intense training. But if you improve your aerobic endurance simply, then you're going to see that impact. An Ironman bike, on the other hand, if we compare that to the 8-minute test, that's more than 99% powered by the aerobic metabolism and less than 1% of the anaerobic metabolism. But imagine that you're already maybe on that upper end, so you're using 95% of aerobic metabolism for an 8-minute effort. Then that means that this 8-minute effort is heavily skewed towards the Ironman side of things. So an 8-minute effort is more similar to an Ironman bike compared to, for example, a 1-minute effort, which broadly speaking might be around a 50-50 split between aerobic and anaerobic energy production. So that is very interesting and something that's not perhaps that well understood or commonly known, I should say. So all this to say, it makes sense that the training that you have been doing, which has improved your aerobic base, has also been reflected in that 8-minute test, because it is very aerobic and it is sort of similar to an Ironman bike, even as funny as it sounds. However, as you know, you can improve your aerobic fitness either with doing this long, slow distance base building, or by doing intensity, or by doing both. And my question to you is, why choose just one? Why not go for both and not put all your eggs in one basket? You definitely don't need to do massive amounts of intensity, but doing even just one hard, high intensity bike session per week can really help you keep improving and help you avoid reaching a performance plateau. Because I think that at some point, a focus on just base miles, long, slow distance, it may stop yielding improvements because the body gets used to that stimulus over time. And I think that, don't get me wrong, if you have time, a lot of time to train, you can keep improving to a very good level with just base building, but you need to have time, both like a lot of time every single week, but also you need to probably, these improvements manifest themselves over years and years. So it's not something that you're going to see super quickly necessarily. You need to be very patient with that type of training, as any endurance athlete should be. But especially if you go that base building route, which is a good way to go, but then you need to be aware that these things, they take time to really turn into fitness adaptations that you can see power-wise on different distances. So my question then is, you can have both. You don't need to choose either or. To get down in a little bit of a technical rabbit hole as for why having both is a good thing, the reason here is that a key factor for endurance adaptations is the amount and the activity of a very famous protein called PGC1 alpha. PGC1 alpha is something that can directly induce adaptations, the most favorable endurance adaptations that we get from endurance exercise. And these would be mitochondrial biogenesis, so more mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the cell, angiogenesis, so capillarization, and increases in fat oxidation. Now, there are a couple of different options for how to actually turn on that PGC1 alpha activity, and it turns out that one major pathway is intensive exercise, and another major pathway is extensive exercise, so the long, slow distance or base building that you mentioned. So when we know this, instead of relying on just one of these pathways, we can actually use both. It's like how you could fill a bathtub way quicker if you open 2 taps of water rather than just one. I'm not saying that it's a straight analogy like that. It's not as simple as that, obviously, but I think that it makes sense to use both. And finally, I think that actually the most compelling evidence for why you should do both is that you won't find a single professional athlete or even a single high-level amateur like a Kona podium finisher that completely skips intensity when training for an Ironman. And that is the best evidence of all, in my opinion, that we should have both. So we should model patterns of the people that have had the most success in any given field, whether it's triathlon or outside of it. Training is not that complicated. We know a lot already just based on what has worked for a lot of people in the past. I'm not talking about extreme outliers, but things that you see repeated time and time again among the best in the world. And that is to do a lot of training at low intensities, but they also do high intensity training. And it's not that different either for amateurs compared to the pros. We can take them as models, although we, of course, have less time to train. All that being said, I'm not saying either that you should do the same amount or the same extent or the same intensity every single week of the year. There can definitely be ebbs and flows in this. Maybe you take some periods of the year where you just focus on your base building. I'm not necessarily a fan of that, to be honest. I try to keep some intensity in there throughout the year, but it definitely changes its nature. But I think that it can absolutely work for some people, and especially if you have a lot of time to do that, like really do like a sort of pro cyclist approach to base building, that can be a good way to go for sure. So I'm not saying that you should do the same kind of workout every single week or anything like that, or the same amount of intensity. There will be changes to that, but in your build up to the Ironman, you should, in my opinion, have some intensity in there. So I hope that this answers your question, Oscar. The next question is from Fredrik in Sweden, who writes that I'm planning to do my first lactate lab test sometime this autumn in order to get some baseline values for my base building phase in autumn and winter. What got me thinking is when should I schedule this test? I have my last serious trail race of the season at the end of August, and I will probably take 2 to 3 really easy training weeks after this in order to recover after a summer of fairly high stress training and racing. Good man, Fredrik. That's the thing to do, the right thing to do for sure. I will probably start to ramp up my training late September and get back on a fairly high volume early October. Should I do the test in proximity to my last race or a few weeks into my base building training phase when I have gotten back into the groove after the rest period? All right. Thank you, Fredrik, for your question. You do answer your own question there with that second option that you say about doing it a few weeks into your base building phase. That is exactly what I recommend that you do. So after your couple of weeks of really easy training or rest, you get back into training. You do, let's say, at least 2 and up to 4 weeks where you are building back into training. And in that period, 2 to 4 weeks after getting back to your more normal training, that's when, not necessarily normal training, but just 2 to 4 weeks after resuming training after the break. That's what I'm saying. In that phase is where, or that period is when I would take the test. So you don't want to do it immediately, because just getting straight off the couch, your body is going to do things very differently than even after just 2 weeks of consistent endurance training. But as well, you don't want to make it too late, because you actually want to maximize the benefits from the test by being able to use the results that you get from it for the most amount of time possible. So that's the thinking. That's why I think that 2 to 4 weeks after resuming training is a good period to shoot for taking that lactate test. I think it's much better than taking it in proximity to your last race, because then, you could do that. And we talked about this on the show before, that the heart rate zones that you would get from a lactate test, they stay fairly constant. So you could still use them, and it might be a cool thing to do to see, like, when you are really at the peak of your fitness, what were your lactate values and what did your lactate curve look like? And especially if you do it again the next year, it's really interesting to get that sort of comparison and try to make correlations between your results and the lactate curve that led to those results. So I'm not saying that it's wrong, but I just think that for the training purpose, which I think is the main purpose of taking a lactate test anyway, to maximize the effectiveness of your training, then it makes a bit more sense to do it early on in the base building phase, because then even though the pace and power zones that you get will change with time, so you can't really rely on them for too long, but the heart rate zones will stay the same. But at the beginning phases, you can also get an idea of the power and pace zones from the test that you're taking, which gives you a good starting point. And then what you can do is to start to figure out, let's say that your endurance running should be sub or slower than 5 minutes per kilometer, and then you start to run a lot of your endurance runs at, let's say, 5:10 or something like that, and you start to get a feel for what it feels like. You can correlate the RPE, the rating of perceived exertion, that you are running at, and then you know that even a few weeks or months into your training phase, when you're running 4:45 per kilometer and it feels exactly the same, you know that, okay, my lactate is probably right where it should be, so it's no big deal, and also my heart rate validates it. So that's another reason that it might make more sense to do it at the start of the base building phase, because you do get a sort of starting point for your pace and power zones, even though, as said, the heart rate zones are the ones that will be more sticky and that will be usable for the longer term. One more thing to add, if you are a more experienced endurance athlete, then that means that your body will be quicker to get back towards its normal as soon as you start training again. So, for example, if you have 5 years of very solid training in you, then even after just 2 weeks of resuming training, you will be already getting quite fit and you will be completely fine to do that lactate test. Maybe for somebody who's only done 2 years of endurance sport before that a life on sitting as a sedentary, or at least many years as a sedentary individual, maybe they might be better served actually waiting 3 or even 4 weeks and not doing it right after 2 weeks of resuming training, just to give the body a bit more time to adapt to where they will be for the large part of their training phase. Then again, there's always a compromise that this athlete probably has the most need for the results because they don't have the same intuitive feel for where they should be in terms of intensity in their training. So they don't want to wait too long either, and not let 2 months pass and still not having taken the test. But that's just another consideration for you. The athletic experience, if you will, can have a little bit of an impact in how you do it. But in general, I think for most about anybody, 2 to 4 weeks after resuming training is a good time. The next question is also from Sweden. Thank you, everybody from Sweden, for being so active listeners. I really appreciate that. This is from Erik, who writes that when life happens, as for example, let's say I can't swim for a week, but I can add some more bike rides or running workouts. Should I do so? Should I add these bikes or runs? And in that case, which workouts should I prioritize? My thinking is that I want to keep the week pretty much the same as my plan. And actually, Erik is using one of my plans on Training Peaks. So he's asking about how to change this plan when life happens. My thinking is that I want to keep this week similar to the training stress score planned, and that an easy week should be easy, a hard week should remain hard, etc. And then I just add on technical training or endurance training in whatever discipline I can manage. And ideally it would be swimming or cycling, since it's less taxing on the body than running. But what are your thoughts? Okay, thank you, Erik, for your question, and thank you for using my training plan as well. First, one caveat for all the listeners: if you actually have an individual coach, then you should ask them what to do when life happens and let them help you with this. I'm not saying that you should just completely remove your own responsibility, but you should definitely not just go and do things off the cuff without first telling your coach about it. So discuss that with your coach. But otherwise, for all listeners that either have a training plan that you bought or that you created yourself, you're a self-coach athletes. If you are one of these athletes, then the following that I will say I think applies for most of you. And that is that, yes, Erik, absolutely right. You want to keep your easy weeks easy and your hard weeks hard when that is possible. But in some cases, something major might happen. So let's say that you have to travel for work. It comes up unexpectedly, and you really can't keep a hard, challenging week hard the same way that you plan to. Then actually it might make sense to move an easy week forward and make that week the easy week then that you're traveling anyway. You need to take into account things like travel and stress, that it might not be the recovery week that it was supposed to be. So be sure to be in tune with your body, and if you need a little bit of extra training once you get back home and can actually recover in the routine of your own home and your own normal routines, that's fine. Do that as well. Just the idea is to make sure that you balance hard training with hard recovery. But that's a situation that happens, and quite a lot actually, at least in my own coaching client sample, it does happen quite a lot. So based on that, I would say that be prepared to do that, to change a hard week to an easy week, and then you basically switch weeks around that way when something major happens. But if it's just something minor that, as you said, you can't swim, but you can do everything else, then yeah, keep the easy week easy, the hard weeks hard. And as you say, I would just add technical training and endurance training in whatever discipline you can manage in most cases. There are some exceptions. For example, let's say that you are doing, in the original plan, you might have had 3 swims, 3 bikes, and 3 runs in a week. And let's say that you, for some reason, your pool closes, so you can't swim at all. So you only have 3 bikes and 3 runs, and you decide to add 2 more bikes and 1 more run. And maybe in the original plan, you only had one intense bike ride and 1 intense run and 1 intense swim, or 2 intense swims perhaps. Then, since you now are going to have 5 bikes because you added 2 of them, because you lost 3 swims and you added 1 run, then you might want to make one of those rides that you added a hard ride, because after all, you also lost 2 hard swims. So you're losing some intensity to the week. So it's not necessarily that you always should just add technical and endurance training, but you also need to consider that if you do more training in those individual disciplines, can you actually recover, since you will be doing more monotonous training from the perspective that you'll be doing more training in the same discipline. So don't overdo it. It's always better to err on the side of caution and make sure that you can remain consistent. And when you are going to do those high intensity workouts, that you actually manage to do them as intensely as planned. So don't go overboard with this, but I think that there is a time and place where you can add some intensity in there as well when life happens, as you say. And as for which disciplines to add, if let's say it's not just a swim that goes to plan, in this case it might be whatever discipline. You're right that if you're well balanced as an athlete, then maybe prioritizing swimming and cycling makes sense. It's less taxing, less of an injury risk. You still get a lot of general aerobic training, which is great, and you can recover slightly faster from them than from running for almost everybody. Then absolutely go for them. But you can also consider what are your strengths and weaknesses. So it might make sense to, if the opportunity arises, to work on your weaknesses. So let's say that the running is your weakness, and you find yourself in a position where your pool is closed and you have 2 weeks without swimming, 4 weeks without swimming. So you basically have no choice. Maybe what you do in that situation is to just choose to focus on running. So you keep the cycling the way it was originally planned, and you add running. I should add, by the way, I take this back a little bit, because you don't want to jump from to make 2 big jumps in running volume. So in this case, maybe instead of, if we take the same example as I used last time, you lose 3 swims, I would not add 3 runs to the 3 runs you originally had. But you might want to add 2 runs and 1 bike. And one of those runs that you add could be really, really short, just a 20 to 30 minute run. And the other run could be a bit longer to make sure that you don't go overboard with how big of an increase in the total volume you make. Maybe you just try to get in an extra hour of running in that first week, and maybe an extra hour, 15 minutes in the second week, if in this scenario we have 2 weeks without a pool. So again, minimizing risk there, make sure that you can stay consistent. But working on considering your strengths and weaknesses is another thing that I would do. And that also goes for when it comes to the technical versus fitness aspects. So if, for example, you have an opportunity to do more swimming and the technical aspect is a limiter for you, then quite a lot of the added swimming, because you can't bike, for example, or you can't run, might be technically focused. So it doesn't have to be hard, but you're just working on technique. So that's another aspect to consider for sure. What are your strengths and weaknesses? So I think these are the major things to consider when it comes to how to change the plan when life happens. One more thing, by the way, I don't think it makes sense to think too much about the training stress score, specifically the TSS numbers. You don't need to focus on hitting a certain number of TSS, because not all TSS is created equal, as we talked about before. And also, TSS isn't necessarily the best metric anyway to go by, even if it were created equal. So I would say I honestly prefer to use duration as the primary way to measure training load, and then I just have the intuitive feel for, well, how hard is this week just by looking at the structure of the week. And that, I think, is what makes the most sense to do. And then TSS will maybe help you validate that a bit. So definitely look at it. You don't need to ignore it, but you need to be aware of its limitations. That's the only thing that I'm saying. And I get so many emails about TSS that I'm getting more and more aware that a lot of people are not aware of the limitations of TSS and the imperfections of it, which is why I may come across sometimes as a TSS critic. I'm not necessarily that, but it just comes with a ton of caveats. That's all I'm saying. All right, hope this helps you, Erik. And finally, I got a question that I want to answer really quickly because it's a time-sensitive one. It's from Brian in the US, who writes, I'm racing in 10 days in Cleveland at the US Age Group National Championships. What kind of advice would you give athletes who end up racing in the later waves on how to time their warm-ups? For me, transition closes at 6:45 and my wave doesn't start until 8:22. Should I even bother to ride the bike from 6 to 6:20 like I would normally and then jog from 6:25 to 6:35? Or should I just relax and rest until 7:45, then do strides on the beach before putting on the wetsuit? Thank you, Brian, for a question. So what I would say here is that, yes, I would ride the bike before putting it into transition. Primarily, you want to check that everything is in order still on the morning of with the bike. But since you're on the bike anyway, be sure to wake up the legs by doing a few bursts of intensity, something like 3 times 1 minute to threshold or above. So you would do that, as you say, before putting it in transition. Maybe it's 6 o'clock to 6:20. It's for sure, like it's 2 hours before your race, but it's still probably has a little bit of a benefit. And if nothing else, psychologically, I think it does have a benefit. And the major thing there is that you can actually check your bike and it works well in all the gears. Then for running, I would actually suggest that you do something different to what you suggest. What I would do is to bike as late as possible, but without causing myself stress about checking everything in transition. So you might actually start your bike ride at maybe 6:10 and bike from 6:10 to 6:30, and then check in the transition. Transition closes at 6:45. And then you might rest for a while, and you might start your run at, let's say, 7:20. Run for 20 minutes. We're at 7:40. And that run as well, by the way, should include a few bursts of intensity, something like the 3 times 1 minute to threshold or above. Then you get changed into your wetsuit and get ready. So that would be around 7:45, as you say in your question. And then do your swim warm-up so that you give yourself at least 15 minutes in the water and you finish the warm-up as late as possible, as close to the race as possible. And usually you would have to expect to wait at least 10 minutes before the start on shore. That's okay. Sometimes it might be even more, but it's still worth going through this all. And now you managed to actually run way closer to the race than in your original plan because you waited until 7:20. So you did the run after doing the transition check-in. And of course, by the way, what you need for this is to have a second pair of running shoes with you. So you would not do that warm-up in your race shoes because they would be in transition already. I have an episode on race day warm-ups that I'll link to in the episode description. It's episode 35. And I'll also link to the paper by Asker Jokendrup that I mentioned in the first question, or the correction for last week's question. That's a wrap for this week's episode. Thank you to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Use the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, all caps, to get your first box or tube for free. Or use the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW20 to get 20% off your entire order. And thank you to Roka, that you can find on roka.com. That's ROKA.com. And check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear, and get 20% off your entire order with the promo code TTS, all caps. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.